Ever wondered why the same dollar seems to buy less and less each year? It's a question that puzzles many, and the answer lies in a term we often hear but might not fully understand: inflation. At its core, inflation is a phenomenon that impacts everyone's daily life, from the price of your morning coffee to the cost of a new home. It's a concept that seems elusive, but is in fact closely tied to our everyday experiences. In this video, we're going to demystify inflation. We'll delve into what it is, how it works, and why it's so crucial to our economic system. We'll explore the factors that cause inflation, the effects it has on everyday life, and how it's controlled by those in power. So buckle up as we dive into the world of inflation. It's a journey that will shed light on a key aspect of our economic reality and help you navigate it with a bit more confidence. In simple terms, inflation is the rate at which the general level of prices for goods and services is rising. Now imagine this scenario: you've got $1 in your pocket. Today, that dollar might buy you a candy bar at the corner store. But fast forward a year and suddenly, that same candy bar costs $1.05. You've still got $1, but it doesn't stretch as far as it used to. That, in a nutshell, is inflation in action. It's like an invisible tax that nibbles away at your purchasing power. But how do we measure this sneaky little economic phenomenon? Enter the Consumer Price Index, or CPI for short. The CPI is, in essence, a shopping basket filled with a mix of goods and services that an average consumer might buy. Everything from a gallon of milk to a haircut is in there. The price of this basket is tracked over time. If the cost of the items in the basket increases, we say that inflation is occurring. But here's where it gets interesting. Not all items in the CPI basket carry the same weight. Some goods and services are considered more essential than others. For instance, the price of gasoline might be weighted more heavily than the price of movie tickets. This is because changes in the price of gasoline can have a bigger impact on a consumer's budget than changes in the price of movie tickets. It's also worth noting that the CPI is just one measure of inflation. There are others, like the Producer Price Index, PPI, which tracks the cost of inputs for producers, or the GDP deflator, which measures the change in prices of all new, domestically produced final goods and services in an economy. But for most of us, the CPI is the most relatable measure. So to recap, inflation is the rate at which the general level of prices for goods and services is rising, and it's measured using indices like the CPI. As these prices rise, each unit of currency can buy fewer goods and services. So as prices rise, each unit of currency buys fewer goods and services. That's inflation for you. But what causes inflation? Why do prices keep going up? Good question. Inflation is primarily driven by two main forces: demand pull and cost push. Let's break down these terms and see how they impact our economy. First up, we have demand pull inflation. Imagine this: a sudden surge of people wanting to buy the latest smartphone. The demand is high, but the supply is limited. What happens? The price goes up, right? That's demand pull inflation in action. When consumers' demand for goods and services exceeds their supply, prices naturally increase. It's the basic law of supply and demand at work. Now let's talk about cost push inflation. This happens when the costs of production increase, causing companies to raise their prices to maintain profit margins. For example, if the price of oil skyrockets, it would cost more to transport goods. Companies might then pass this cost on to consumers by raising their prices. So, in essence, increasing costs of production push up the prices, hence the term cost push inflation. It's also worth mentioning that inflation isn't always a bad thing. In fact, a little inflation is considered healthy for the economy. It encourages spending and investment, which can stimulate economic growth. However, too much inflation can lead to economic instability, making it harder for people to plan for the future as the value of money keeps changing. Inflation is also influenced by expectations. If people expect prices to rise in the future, they might start buying more now, which can actually trigger inflation. This is known as expected inflation, and it's another factor that central banks have to keep an eye on when they're setting interest rates. So whether it's people demanding more or costs pushing up, inflation can be the result. It's a complex dance of economic factors, each playing their part in the grand ballet of our economy. But don't worry, we're not left helpless. In our next scene, we'll explore how inflation can be controlled and managed, so stay tuned. Inflation doesn't just make your dollar less powerful, it has other effects too. Let's start with the economy as a whole. When inflation is moderate, it can actually be a sign of a healthy economy. This is because moderate inflation often indicates that businesses are doing well, people are buying products and services, and the economy is growing. This kind of inflation can encourage spending because people expect prices to rise in the future, so they buy goods and services now. It also encourages businesses to invest and expand as they anticipate higher profits from rising prices. But what happens when inflation is not moderate? Well, if inflation gets too high, it can cause a myriad of economic problems. For one, it can lead to an economic condition known as hyperinflation. This is when prices rise so rapidly that the concept of pricing becomes meaningless. Currency loses its value, and the economy can spiral into chaos. History has seen numerous examples of this, such as post-World War I Germany or Zimbabwe in the early 21st century. High inflation can also create uncertainty in the economy. When prices are constantly changing, businesses may struggle to plan for the future, and consumers might delay purchases, slowing economic growth. Now let's shift gears and talk about the effects of inflation on individuals. On a personal level, inflation can erode purchasing power. This means the same amount of money buys you less over time. It's like being on a financial treadmill where you're running just to stay in place. Moreover, if your income doesn't keep pace with inflation, you could find yourself falling behind. This is especially tough on people with fixed incomes like retirees, as they might struggle to afford the same goods and services they once did. However, there's a flip side to this. If your income does keep pace with inflation, or even outpaces it, you could actually benefit. This is because your income is rising while your debt stays the same, making it effectively cheaper to pay off. So inflation can be a double-edged sword, beneficial in moderation but harmful in excess. So, now we know what inflation is and what causes it, but can we control it? Well, it's not as straightforward as flipping a switch, but yes, we can. And the superheroes in this story are central banks. Central banks like the Federal Reserve in the United States, the Bank of England in the UK, or the European Central Bank in Europe, are primarily responsible for managing inflation. But how do they do it? Let's break it down. One key method is through something called monetary policy. This is essentially how central banks control the supply of money, and they do this using two main tools: interest rates and open market operations. First, let's talk about interest rates. Central banks can raise or lower interest rates to control inflation. If inflation is too high, central banks can increase interest rates. This makes borrowing more expensive, which discourages spending and slows down the economy. On the other hand, if inflation is too low, central banks can lower interest rates to encourage spending and stimulate the economy. Now, onto open market operations. This is when central banks buy or sell government securities like bonds in the open market. When a central bank wants to reduce inflation, it sells securities. This takes money out of the economy, reducing the money supply and slowing down economic activity. Conversely, when a central bank wants to stimulate the economy, it buys securities, injecting money into the economy. So these are the primary ways central banks manage inflation. But remember, it's a delicate balancing act. If a central bank acts too aggressively, it could slow down the economy too much, leading to a recession. But if it doesn't act aggressively enough, inflation could spiral out of control. So, while inflation is a complex phenomenon, central banks have tools at their disposal to keep it in check. So, let's sum up what we've learned about inflation. In simple terms, inflation is the rate at which the general level of prices for goods and services is rising, and subsequently purchasing power is falling. It's like a sneaky thief that stealthily reduces your money's value over time. The causes of inflation are multifaceted. It can be due to demand pull factors where demand outpaces supply, or cost push factors where the cost of production increases. External influences like global market changes or government policies can also play a part. The effects of inflation are wide-ranging. It impacts everything from the cost of your morning coffee to the price tag on your dream house. But don't panic, as there are ways to control inflation. Central banks, for instance, use tools like interest rates and monetary policies to keep inflation in check. Inflation is a part of our economic life, and understanding it helps us make sense of the world around us.